Good evening everyone and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if it is your first time here. Let me get straight to the point. A few months ago I uploaded a video about my recent trip to Cuba, and whilst I didn't want this channel to become political, when you speak about Cuba the discourse is inherently political. And that's why from that video I got so many comments bringing up issues often related to Cuba, such as human rights, poverty, dictatorship, and all these kind of things. And so I thought I would make a short series of videos going through these issues with you and give you my 2 penny worth, or 2 cents, depending on where you're watching this from, about what life is really like there. I know many of my subscribers are from the United States, and I know it's quite hard for you guys to visit the island, so I thought these videos could be quite helpful if you wanted to learn something about your neighbors really, and somehow maybe start to understand each other a bit more. But without further ado, let's get started. This video is going to be about poverty in Cuba. Okay, so what is poverty? It is really hard to define what poverty is, because it really depends on the part of the world you are from. It's a very relative concept. And before I get started, just a little caveat. I was born in the Western world in a fairly wealthy country, so I am necessarily biased with my definition of poverty. But bear in mind that if you are from the Western world, you've probably spent most of your life in the most privileged part of the world, and this clearly affects your judgment. Another big mistake that I noticed that people make when speaking about Cuba is that, for clear political reasons, they tend to compare Cuba with the United States. And I think there you'd be comparing apples with pears. We want to compare apples with apples. How can you compare a small island in the Caribbean with a world superpower? Clearly, the two things just don't go together. If you wanted to compare Cuba to another country, you should probably compare it to countries in the same region with similar economies and similar resources, such as, for example, Haiti and Jamaica. And at that point, the comparison is not only more fair, but it's more meaningful for a conversation about Cuba. So let's get started. To define poverty, I decided to rely on the United Nations definitions of poverty. I'll read it out for you. Poverty includes low incomes and the inability to acquire the basic goods and services necessary for survival with dignity. Poverty also encompasses low levels of health and education, poor access to clean water and sanitation, inadequate physical security, lack of voice, and insufficient capacity and opportunity to better one's life. It's a very complex definition, but it's possibly the only one we can rely on to define what poverty is without being affected by the bias I mentioned before. So I decided to bullet point it, a bit because of my OCD and also because I love bullet points, but let's start from the first one. Low income and the inability to acquire basic goods and services necessary for survival with dignity. On YouTube, you will find plenty of videos showing you that in Cuba, a doctor earns less than a taxi driver. And I have to say that from my own personal experience and by admission of a taxi driver, that's actually true. My understanding is that a doctor in Cuba earns between $30 and $50 a month, as opposed to a taxi driver that can earn basically unlimited money. Why is that? Well, first of all, if you're a doctor, your wages are paid in Cuban pesos. And if you watched my other video, you will understand how the currency system works in Cuba. The currency tends to lose a lot of value over time, so clearly getting paid in Cuban pesos is not the best for you. On the other hand, taxi drivers get normally paid in foreign currencies, such as US dollars, euro, Canadian dollars, or whatever it is really, which generally tend to be a bit more stable and of course tend to hold their values much longer over time. But that's not the only point. If you're a taxi driver, you are very likely to get tips. And it really depends on where you're from, but in the Western world, where I'm from at least, it is quite usual to tip a taxi driver something like, I don't know, 10 euros, 15 euros, depending on what the service was, clearly. And while 10 euros is not a lot of money for Europeans, it's just the price of a fast food meal realistically, it is a lot of money in Cuba because it's basically 1/3 of the salary of a doctor. And this is why taxi drivers actually end up earning more money than doctors. And well, I guess this answers the first point. Are incomes quite low in Cuba? Yes, they are if you work for the state, but they are quite average or really above average if you work for private enterprises or partially private enterprises such as taxi companies. However, the United Nations make another very strong point in the first bullet point, which is the inability to acquire basic goods and services necessary for survival with dignity. Now, that's very true that if you're a doctor, you don't earn a lot of money, but you have to take into account that all your needs are provided for by the state. So you're provided with a certain amount of food per week. You're also given an apartment by the state. your children's university is paid by the state. So I'm not saying that it's good money. I'm absolutely not saying that. I'm just saying that you have to take that into account if you wanted to make a meaningful comparison with other parts of the world. And on this note, I want to bring in an example of a person that I met there. Long story short, I was at the 1st of May parade. The 1st of May is the International Workers' Day, possibly the most important date in socialist and communist countries. And I went to this parade, which was beautiful, and when I was there, I started speaking to a gentleman. He must have been in his late 50s or something like that, and we started talking. I got him a drink and we started talking about Cuba, what life in Cuba is like, and bit by bit he started to open up with me. Main point is that this gentleman told me that his job is that of a street sweeper, so basically cleans street, and he's employed by the state. And as we understood, if a doctor earns between $30 and $50 a month, I didn't dare to ask what's the salary of a street sweeper, but I would assume probably a bit lower than that. However, this gentleman told me that he lives in a 2-bedroom apartment with his son not far from the center of the city, and his son is actually studying at university to become a doctor. And his wife sadly passed away a few years ago, so they can rely only on his wages, on his salary. Now I wonder, would it be possible in the Western world to have a 2-bedroom apartment not far from the center of the city and have a son studying medicine at university to become a doctor without paying a penny? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. I know what I think about it, but I'm not going to share it with you. So, whilst we found out that incomes are quite low, this does not seem to impact on people's ability to acquire basic goods and services for survival with dignity being the key word. Okay, now, so moving on to the next point, low levels of health and education. And again, what that gentleman told me is going to be very helpful to understand this. We were walking not far from Havana Vieja, the old part of the city, while he was guiding me around and showing me amazing places, when I told him that in our countries, it's not really the case for Italy, but I know in many parts of the Western world, you need to pay for healthcare, hospitals, doctors, and all these kind of things. And when I told him that, he was absolutely bewildered. He could not believe it. It was just such a exotic concept for him, just something like, what do you mean? You have to pay for healthcare? And he didn't seem to grasp the concept. It's just something like, as if for him, it was an absolute given that the state will provide for your healthcare. And well, listen, who am I to judge? Who am I to say? But in my country, for example, in Italy, most of the healthcare expenses are covered by the state. Like it or not, it can be handy. Let's put it this way. Clearly, there are pros and cons and whatever it is. I'm not going to delve into that at the moment. But I can say that having free healthcare for all people in your country is not exactly a feature of poor countries, to be honest with you. And it was actually one of the main points of the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro. Free healthcare for everyone. Now I wonder, if we were to compare this system to the United States, well, I don't want to go there, but if we were to compare this system to, for example, Haiti or Jamaica, for example, well, I've got a feeling that some Jamaican people would love to live in Cuba when it comes to healthcare. But do let me know your thoughts about this. And again, that gentleman who works as a street sweeper has a son studying at university and he can provide for him. Now, could you do that in the Western world? Well, in Cuba, he can, because university or education is paid for by the state. You may not like this system, but listen, we have to give it to Cuba. Free education is a thing. Okay, next point, there's not really much to say. Poor access to clean water and sanitation. Well, listen, I have to say, sanitation, well, listen, there were toilets everywhere with running water. They did the job, that's all I can say. Pretty much everywhere I went to, even in rural, I cannot say that word, even in rural areas, I could find perfectly functioning toilets. And now, clean water, and well, in the first days I was a bit scared or worried to have water from the tap. It's something I don't do where I live. Why would I do it in Cuba, first of all? But well, many times I didn't have any bottle with clean water, so I actually drank water from the tap, and I was absolutely fine. And most people in Cuba told me that it's absolutely fine to drink water from the tap. That does not shout poor country to me, quite the opposite. If you travel to a poor country like I did many times, well, then you would know what happens to you if you drink water from the tap. And it's not a nice experience. Well, inadequate physical security again. If you've ever heard of anyone going to Cuba, If you watch my other video, listen, I can guarantee it's possibly the safest place I've ever been to, and I'm including the place where I live, the city where I live in the Western world, possibly one of the wealthiest cities in the world, really. I felt much safer in Cuba than where I live. Now, some people would argue, oh, it's because of the tight control that the police has got on the population. Listen, that's another point, and I may discuss that in my next video about human rights. But as far as I was concerned as a tourist, well, really, I couldn't have felt safer. So, another point for Cuba, really. But now we got to the next point: lack of voice. Well, I have to say, I was lucky enough to meet people from different age groups, let's say, and I can say that the young people did not feel really represented by the politics. So, as a matter of fact, someone told me, a person I met there, that a couple of years ago, I believe, I may be wrong, but a while ago, there were protests against the Cuban government, and it was mostly young people, and their revolutionary slogan, motto, was Patria o Muerte, so fatherland or death. Like, we are going to fight against imperialism until we become the masters and the owners of our own country. And if the price we have to pay is death, we will do so. Well, what these young people were shouting in these protests was actually Patria o Vida, and which literally means fatherland or life, as in, at some point we will have to pick between our own independence and freedom, the way we've known it through the revolution, or our own life. And well, listen, I guess it's not a good position to be in. Many young people I spoke with actually seemed to genuinely appreciate what the revolution did for them, all the things they got, but they all felt it was time for change. Well, lack of voice, well, Cuba, I'm afraid it's a no from me. Or better, it is true, there is a lack of voice in my opinion. But again, it's something I will discuss better in another video about human rights and political representation. So again, do follow my channel. And now, last but not least, possibly the main point in my opinion, insufficient capacity to better one's life. Now, when you're born in a capitalistic system like I was, and most likely many of you were, you know you're the master of your own fate. So bettering your own life is only your responsibility. No one can help you. No one is going to help you with that. However, this narrative, I'm afraid, is inherently flawed because, listen, I was born in a fairly wealthy part of the world, and yes, I did have opportunities to improve my life. If I was born in another part of the world and I would have had no access to education, no access to healthcare, no access to God knows what, I would probably be illiterate now. While in Cuba, even if you're born in a lower class, I hate the concept of class, but it's very Marxist, so the Cubans would be proud of me. If you're in the lower social classes, you still have somehow a way to become a doctor. You can start as being the son of a street sweeper, with all due respect to street sweepers, of course, but you can actually aim to become a doctor, and you are provided with the means to do so. However, this does not mean that you have the freedom to do so. It's something I didn't grasp fully when I was in Cuba. And so I hope some of you guys can actually help me with this. I could not understand what level of involvement the state has in your life choices. I mean, if you are terrible at science, for example, are you still free to study as a doctor, or you have necessarily to go for other professions? So really, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you got everything paid for by the state somehow, which means, yes, you can be the son of a street sweeper, born in the poorest part of the country, and still aim or hope or dream to become a doctor. And that dream can quite easily come true. On the other hand, is it you that makes that decision, or is it the state that makes that decision for you? I actually don't know the answer. So please, if you know more about Cuba than I do, let me know in the comments. And in the meantime, thank you for watching. I'll be uploading a few more of these videos to discuss topics such as the embargo, human rights, figure of Fidel Castro, and all these kind of things. If you have any piece of advice, any tip about how to make these videos more entertaining and more easy to engage with, please do let me know. It's a first experience for me, so I hope you like this video. Please do follow my channel to get an update when the new videos are released. Thank you for watching, and see you later.